Excellent. Well, I hope everyone can hear me. I am Jamshid Choksi, the chair of the Department of Central Eurasian Studies, and I am very pleased today to introduce Cynthia Buckley, professor of sociology at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. Cindy is delivering the Jean and Dennis Sinor Faculty Fellowship Lecture. Her topic is population change and socio-political stability in Central Asia, which I believe is the topic of her current upcoming book. So we're getting a sneak peek. Wonderful. I know that Dennis would be delighted, and so would Jean. Dennis endowed the lectures in the memory of his spouse and himself. And to have you here talking about very important issues of Central Asia is wonderful, Professor Buckley. A few words about Professor Buckley. She received her bachelor's, master's, and PhD from the University of Michigan, and incidentally, that's where she is right now. She has decamped to Ann Arbor for the pandemic. She's lucky enough to be on sabbatical. So she received a PhD in sociology from the University of Michigan, then taught on the faculty at the University of Texas, Austin, served as program director for Eurasia at the Social Science Research Council, and then moved to the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, to the Department of Sociology there. So please join me in a rousing welcome to Cindy. And just to let you know, she will present for about 45 to 50 minutes. Thereafter, she will moderate the questions in person. If you also have questions you want to send via chat, the SUS administrator, April Younger, will forward those questions to Cindy as well. So please welcome Cindy. The virtual stage is yours. You have an audience from around the world, and we look forward to hearing what you have to edify us with. Welcome.
Okay, thank you so much, Jamshid. I also would like to thank the Center for Eurasian Studies of the Hamilton Lugar School of International Studies at Indiana University. I'd like to thank the faculty and staff for the great honor of giving this Sinor Lecture, but I'd also especially like to thank Ms. April Younger, who has done an amazing job, as she always does, ironing out all administrative and technical difficulties. That said, if anything happens during the talk, blame me, not her. Before we get started, I wanted to give a few acknowledgements to some of my colleagues, most specifically Ms. Samantha Lenich and my U of I research assistants. I also would like to point out to the audience that this is just the opening act. There is another lecture coming up on April 20th with Nicola Di Cosmo, which looks like it will be extraordinarily interesting and informative. So I know I will be back to attend that one. This reflects on research that was supported by the European Union Center and the Office of Vice Provost for Undergraduate Education of the University of Illinois. A little bit of academic entrepreneurship on my part for directing our Grand Challenge Learning project. I got research funds that helped me get to Central Asia to do some of this work. I'd also like to thank the Center for Russian, East European, and Eurasian Research and the Population Research Center at the University of Michigan, where I am right now. And as well, my colleagues at USAID, UNICEF, IOM, World Bank, Global Data Lab, Asian Development Bank, and the National Statistical Agencies of Central Asia. They have been extraordinarily patient as I wake up at 3 a.m. to call them to figure out what exactly the data was that they normalized for this estimate or for that estimate. It's been an interesting and really informative collegial relationship that's been developing over the last few years, and I couldn't have done it without them. The work I'm going to present today complements some concurrent work that I'm engaged with that focuses on Ukraine rather than Central Asia. One is a Minerva project on which I am a co-PI. It is directed by Eric Heron from the University of West Virginia. And also Ralph Clem is a co-PI on that award as well. And that's really looking at state capacity in Ukraine, Georgia, and Estonia. And I'm about to start a Norwegian Research Council project that will be directed by Geir Flick, that is looking at values and orientations and political mobilization in Ukraine as well. Much of the work I've been doing in Central Asia translates into this work I'm currently engaged with. But most importantly, I would like to thank the countless informative discussions with men and women across the region of Central Asia, in and outside of the Academy for, I'm a little embarrassed to say it, over the past 30 years. I've been going back and forth to this incredible part of the world for 3 decades. And I think, like most people who are tuned in today, am extraordinarily anxious to get back into the field at my soonest opportunity. That said, why don't we get started? Sorry. Let's get, I'm having a little trouble getting to the next one. Just a second. Please excuse me. Again, not April's fault. That's my fault. There we go. Okay, so goals and aims for our talk today really are 4, but I want to give you a caveat. You really are getting the first glimpse at a project I've been working on to some extent over the last 3 years. So when I was first invited, I was so excited. I pulled everything together, and the first draft of this talk ran about 6 hours, and I had over 100 slides. So I hope you're all ready and willing to stick around with me for a while. But in all seriousness, I did cut it down markedly, but it is the initial presentation, and I've tried to cut to the chase to give one of the big overarching arguments here. I also want to point out that I'm going to be covering a lot of data very quickly in some slides just for illustration. If there is anyone in the audience who would like either a written form of this discussion, or are interested in any of the data that I'm discussing, please email me and I'd be more than happy to share. It's been a bit of a hoarder's dream or nightmare, I can't quite decide, in terms of trying to collect as much micro level demographic data as I can. And I'm hoping that this is going to be a repository that other scholars, especially graduate students or younger scholars, can use as well. So please don't hesitate to get in touch, but also let me know if you've got strong suggestions on altering the orientation of the talk. So that said, goals and aims. We're going to highlight the changing demography of the region. And one of the things that is really striking about Central Asia is that over the past 30 years, there has been an enormous sea change in terms of migration, health, and fertility. Mortality has changed. Health practices have changed. Health systems have been reformed, re-reformed, and re-reformed. There have been huge changes in the demography of Central Asia, as many of us know. We're going to highlight some of the key changes in that demographic picture. And secondly, we're going to focus on the structural and cultural context of demographic decision-making within the framework of social and regional settings. So the standard joke in sociology is the only way, this is a difference between a sociologist and an economist. An economist will tell you how people make choices, and a sociologist will tell you why you have no choice. So since my first 2 degrees are in economics and my PhD is in sociology, I like to split the difference and really think about how regional settings and institutions constrain agency and demographic decision-making, and how social norms, cultural beliefs, religious orientations also tend to change the ways in which people make health decisions, family decisions, as well as migration decisions. Third, we're going to look at how demographic change reflects and challenges systems of inequality. There is a growing literature that is extraordinarily verdant about political demography and the way in which the composition of populations exerts political shifts in ideology and changes political strategies, etc. Certainly in the United States, this is a topic of great discussion. I'd like to change that a little bit to say, actually, demographic change doesn't just reflect political orientation or challenges to political structures, but that actually demographic change affords us a unique and valuable insight into systems of inequality. Who benefits from demographic change? Who loses from demographic change? Gives great insight into the ways in which national as well as regional systems of inequality are constructed, reified, and reaffirmed. And then finally, all I'm hoping to do today is broaden our understanding of how demographic change influences socio-political stability in Central Asia specifically, where these demographic changes have been very large, but as well, what Central Asia can teach the world about the ways in which demographic change influences inequality. So it's very fitting, given that I have the honor of giving this lecture named after Indiana's leading light of Central Asia studies, the man who really created and initiated the Central Eurasian and Uralic Studies area within Indiana, Dennis Sinor. In an article, I think this is in an article not that long ago in 2004, which is really, really worth reading. And that's why I put the citation here up for those of you who are interested. He really talks about what is Central Asia? What does it mean? Why does it matter? And I think for many of us who have thought about the region, particularly after 9/11, it's important to believe that for the larger public of our times, there was barely any political substance connected with the idea of Central Asia until quite recently. It was historical with the Great Game, or it was, the theme of travel logs, but it's really a new emergence that Central Asia has become such a central geopolitical focus for many scholars. And I think really thinking about what is Central Asia serves us well, because another theme in his work had to do with Orientalism. And really, when we think about Central Asia, as social scientists, we're thinking about internal and external othering. As Patricia Hills Collins likes to say, we see Central Asia through a interpretive lens. We are really looking at controlling images. And when we think of Central Asia, especially in the history that is wrought with imperial controversy and conflict, we really do see these sort of controlling images that are burned in our minds about what Central Asia is. One of the wonderful repositories one can find online at the Library of Congress is a collection of pictures, particularly from the beginning of the 1900s, about Central Asia, and whether they are the Jews of Bukhara or the Emir himself or a Kazakh family out on the steppes. It's really helpful to think of that idea of the exoticism and the way in which we thought about these controlling images of Central Asia and the extent to which they still matter in the way some scholars and indeed some policymakers tend to approach the region. So what is Central Asia? Depends on what century you decide to pick. I'm going to go quickly through these pictures simply because what I'd like to do here is highlight the fact that Central Asia is somewhat amorphous depending on the historical period you want to focus on. Borders shift, people don't. People sometimes shift across borders. But what we know is that across time, even in the early Soviet period, this is a region that has been dissected and created continuously. My approach to what is Central Asia is a little bit different. I like to look at not only the 5 countries of the former Soviet Union, the stands, if you will, because these are titularly what is often referred to as Central Asia. But at the same time, and particularly given the extraordinarily long and bloody history of US participation in Afghanistan, when one looks at Central Asia, it's very hard to say the border stops at the Oxus. Afghanistan itself contains individuals who identify with cultural orientations found north of the border, be they Turkmen or Uzbeks or Tajiks. And if one includes Afghanistan as part of Central Asia, which I think is highly justified, it is very difficult to then, given our current political context, not bring in Pakistan as well. As we all know, the regions of Waziristan are somewhat murky in terms of the solidification of borders, and there's a lot of uncertainty in terms of where Afghanistan stops and Pakistan begins. In addition, Pakistan does share many cultural and historical experiences that wed it in a very natural way to the history of Afghanistan. And therefore, this is my big 7, not a grade 8, but a big 7. And these are the 7 countries that I'll be discussing in my talk today. In this region, what we're really looking at is broad scale change and persistent challenges. And I'm just going to bring up 6 specific issues that I think are really clear in the literature. I've put some names up here for those of you who are interested in further exploration in this scholarship. But over the last 30 to 40 years, 6 big trends. First, we have growing urbanization. When one thinks back to the early Soviet period and you think back to the nomadic history of much of Central Asia, this recent push towards urbanization that Zaviska and Gerba have talked about in terms of housing, that Polyakov has beautifully written about, is really a striking element. Capital cities are growing quickly. More and more people are moving into urban areas. This affords them greater access to social services, especially health services. It changes the way in which employment and labor market orientations occur. It also means that services like water and sewer systems and transportation now become a different part of life in Central Asia. In addition, in terms of health, reproductive health improvements have been marked across the region. This is not to say there aren't still issues that remain to be addressed in terms of reproductive health, but as the work from Falkingham, Agajanian, Billingsley, and Sporenberg, and to be perfectly honest myself, have documented, reproductive health improvements are one of the most significant developments in the past 30 years across the 7 countries of Central Asia, as I've identified. And reproductive health improvements means that family formation, that family networks have also changed as well. So it's not just about women's health, it's really about the very social fabric of these countries. A third and often overlooked issue are the massive improvements in life expectancy that have taken place across the 7 countries of Central Asia. Michel Guillot, Bill Cockerham, Goryaikin, and many others have really focused on how changes in health behaviors have led to better health outcomes and longer life expectancies, and also really focused on the idea that this is a rising ship or a rising tide that does not lift all boats, shall we say. What Guillot found is that health behaviors in Kyrgyzstan created very different longevity profiles for Kyrgyz men versus Russian men. This is also supported by the work by Bill Cockerham and his many associates, looking at the idea of cultural risk and health, primarily concentrating on non-titular populations within Central Asia and their negative health outcomes. While many of our colleagues from Central Asia themselves have really done a beautiful job of highlighting the efficacy with which Native peoples have adopted more positive health behaviors and as a result are enjoying much longer life expectancy. Fourth, and really importantly, we have population growth stabilization. I'm not saying that we've got stasis, but the wildly high population growth that was seen in the 60s in Soviet Central Asia, as well as in the 70s and 80s in Afghanistan and Pakistan, is now no more. Due in large part to reproductive health improvements and the increasing access to modern contraceptive methods, but in addition, the idea that because of wide-scale outmigration and smaller family sizes, what we're seeing is a much lower rate of population growth. If one looks back to the early 1990s, populations in Afghanistan were doubling basically every 10 years. Now you're at a doubling rate of about 35 years. That's an enormous difference when one is planning for goods and services, when one is trying to politically plan, and one is trying to look towards the future for improving health outcomes and economic outcomes for a country. Fifth, and importantly, as many of you know, it is a period right now of possible demographic dividends. And the demographic dividend is just a fancy way of saying you now have more workers than you have dependents. And the ratio for dependents to workers has been going down in Central Asia. In general, this means you can have lower tax rates. This often means that there is more competition in the labor market. And historically, this has been a great engine for economic innovation and growth. Certainly, people talk about the demographic dividends as one of the main drivers of the emergence of the tiger economies in Southeast Asia decades ago. What's going on with demographic dividends as they are arising and developing in Central Asia? To what extent are they going to be realized in terms of something that can really spur these economies to generating more possibilities for the people of the region? And then lastly, there have been improvements in overall levels of poverty. Poverty is still quite high, but there have been stabilizations in rates, and poverty rates do seem to be decreasing a bit. And here we've got some examples. This is the percent of the population in urban areas for the Central Asian states. And here I take a long-term view from 1960 to 2019. Tajikistan is the only country that has de-urbanized during this period, in part because in 1960, they had just experienced a huge influx of individuals from the rest of the Soviet Union into the urbanized areas within the then SSSR. Most other countries in the region have experienced a shift from primarily rural to a much stronger urban community. Kazakhstan is majority urban, as is Tajikistan and Uzbekistan at this point. Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Pakistan, and Afghanistan are still majority rural countries, but the proportion of their population that is resident in cities is growing. And here, and I think if nothing else, this slide really tells us quite a bit. The total fertility rate, which is a hypothetical cohort measure of fertility, gives us a very clear view of how unbelievably rapidly fertility can change. The total fertility rate is a hypothetical measure that is based on age-specific fertilities of a given year. One looks at the age-specific fertility in 1 year and says, if a woman experiences these age-specific fertility rates, on average, how many children will she bear? In Afghanistan in 1990, the answer to that was 8. By 2021, that number had dropped to 4.7. For me, that's very meaningful simply because I grew up in a family of 9, and trust me, the difference between 9 and 4 or 9 and 5 is really substantial, both in terms of experiential elements, but also in terms of population growth rates. Interestingly enough, when one looks at Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, both of these countries have dipped below the black line, which is a total fertility rate of 2.1, which is what demographers use to estimate replacement fertility. What this highlights is the fact that both Kazakhstan in the early 2000s and Uzbekistan currently have dipped below the fertility rate needed to effectively replenish their population. And so they are actually in population decline right now in terms of fertility. And as I mentioned before, this chart, which shows the past 30 years, the massive improvement in life expectancy at birth, is really striking. Even though Afghanistan lags substantially behind the other 6 countries in the region, even Afghanistan, in a period of 1990 to 2020, this was not necessarily the happiest of times in Afghanistan, but nonetheless, life expectancy rose from 4.2 in 1990 to over 53 by 2020. Life expectancy for most of the other countries in the region is a very respectable 69 or higher. I don't mean to scout out a question before it's asked, but I've already asked several times about this estimate for Uzbekistan having the highest life expectancy rate in Central Asia. There is some question to wonder about the validity of that final life expectancy of over 75, but this is, these are all official data from the national statistical agencies in each one of the countries. So I felt compelled to use what I had from Uzbekistan. And as I said before, the annual rate of population growth does seem to have stabilized quite a bit across all 7 countries. This tracks the annual rate of population growth in Central Asia from 1990 to 2019. And what the World Bank finds is, not surprisingly, Afghanistan has had wild swings of high population growth followed by massive declines in the growth rate, followed by other rises in the population growth rate. This can actually be superimposed upon a graph looking at the intensity of conflict and armed engagement in the country. Kazakhstan in the early 90s, primarily due to the massive outmigration of the ethno-linguistic Russian population, had very negative growth rates throughout the 1990s, but now has come back up again to a fairly positive growth rate. The growth rates in the region are not as high as they once were. They're centered around anywhere between 1% or 2% a year, which means their populations are no longer exploding at the rate that they were earlier. And that leads us to this argument about age dependency. If we look at this chart, what we see is that the number of dependents, and that would be calculated as individuals under the age of 15 and over the age of 65 for every worker in the working ages. What we find is that each worker now in 2019 is supporting far fewer dependent members of the population than they were in 1990. This is what economists call the demographic dividend. When one controls fertility, typically the age dependency ratio will go down because you don't have as many children coming in, because those of you who are parents are well aware they are dependent for quite some time. Another thing that helps the dependency ratio in the Central Asian states at this point is that while life expectancy has improved, it has not reached the level that one finds in Western Europe or other highly developed economies. And therefore, the elderly population is not quite as large as it may become in the future as life expectancy continues to improve. But what economists would argue is that with so many workers and so few dependents, the economic potential of these countries is substantial. Unfortunately, even as of 2021, the estimated percentages of the populations living in poverty across these 7 countries is substantial everywhere, with the exception of Kazakhstan. More than half of the Afghan population is in extreme poverty. 1 in 5 Kyrgyz, 1 in 4 Pakistani, slightly more than 1 in 4 Tajiks, 1 in 5 Turkmen. Again, there is some question about the accuracy of the Uzbek estimate, but again, I used what the National Statistical Agency provides to the World Bank here. In general, the thing to remember is that while poverty is persistent and widespread, it is lower than it had been, particularly in the 1990s. So poverty, while still far too high, also has shown marked patterns of improvement. So if life expectancy is going up, reproductive health is improved, growth rates are going down, dependency ratios are going down. This is really a halcyon picture of demographic context for Central Asia. These are huge improvements that are often overshadowed by focuses on corruption or political incompetence or ethnic conflict. And it's something that I think we need to keep in mind. The demographic picture in Central Asia is a sign of great promise. But before we get too excited, I think we need to ask the question, has the specific rising tides of all of these demographic processes really lifted all the boats in Central Asia? Have these processes benefited the entire populations, or have they benefited some regions within states or some ethno-linguistic groups? We know that this is a region of the world that is fraught with regional variation, that has incredible ethno-linguistic variation, as well as religious variation and other social markers. These are diverse populations. Most importantly, the generational variations are something to be contended with. As demographers, we like to refer to the Trinity of Demography, which is age, period, and cohort. In Central Asia, cohort, the age at which you experience things, whether it be the US invasion of Afghanistan or the collapse of the Soviet Union or the conflict in Osh, the age at which that impacts you will differentiate the way in which it may influence your attitudes throughout the rest of your life. This idea of taking a life course perspective, I think, is really important, and really want to advocate for those of you who are young scholars starting to work in Central Asia. This life course perspective is incredibly valuable in highlighting generational variations. And of course, as someone who works on reproductive health, I can't help but put in gender as well. Have men and women benefited equally from these developments? And there's a reason to ask, because while it looked pretty clear that things were getting much better in terms of life expectancy, that populations tended to become more urban over time, that lots of indications in the demographic quarter were positive, the Gini coefficients here, and remember, this is just a standard measure of inequality. The closer one gets to 1, the closer one gets to perfect inequality. The lower your Gini coefficient, the more equitable the distribution of income in your country. What I've done here, and I didn't draw lines because the estimation of the coefficient changed from year to year on this. So these aren't necessarily completely comparable reports, but I did identify them by color. And basically what you see is that while we've been doing these huge improvements in demography in the region, the Gini coefficient, the level of inequality, has not necessarily declined. We still have some pretty persistent and pernicious issues of income inequality in Central Asia. This makes us think that maybe some of these demographic positives, their effect may be concentrated among some groups and perhaps less important to others. And those of you who have traveled extensively or perhaps live in this region know this all too well. This is a region, this is a part of the world with a regional legacy of inequality. Much of it operates on a rural-urban difference, but not all of it. Just a couple of pictures here from Ashgabat in Turkmenistan, an incredibly well-developed, beautiful capital city, versus the market in Merv. Islamabad, a huge, thriving metropolitan area, versus Karimabad, which isn't really that far away. These are different sorts of opportunity contexts for residents. And you, of course, I'm sure, have your own sort of guiding images to think about this diversity. So what I want to ask here is, how have socio-demographic changes altered or reinforced hierarchies that were pre-existent in terms of inequality? And when we think about what the options might be, right? Demographic pictures are getting better. We have lots of inequality. We had pre-existing inequality. What might happen in terms of how these demographic changes are going to be experienced? Well, the first option would be that the way in which demographic change occurs will simply reflect existing differentials, right? They'll lift everybody 10%, but they're not going to diminish inequality or increase inequality, our other two options. The fourth option, which is much more rare, is that sometimes demographic change can actually flip hierarchies. This means they create new differentials and patterns. They really upset the apple cart, so to speak. And what I'd like to do is pull out 4 quick examples of each one of these processes linked to demographic change in a specific country of Central Asia. And before we get started, to remember that the countries of Central Asia are very large, and they are divided into oblasts or counties, and those counties oftentimes coincide with concentrations of specific ethno-linguistic groups or religious minority groups. But more importantly, those counties are also further divided into smaller district units. And those districts, again, may display a very different experience of the national demographic trends that I just discussed. And because those districts are small, oftentimes they are missed by national censuses or national surveys, right? A survey of 10,000 people in Kazakhstan isn't going to get enough evidence in each one of Kazakhstan's many, many districts to really do analysis. For much of the analysis of these specific small regions, we need census data. And the Central Asian states over the past 30 years have not always been able to mount a census. We know from the United States that it can be a highly political experiment. We also know that it's extraordinarily difficult. It is indeed a major challenge to state capacity to count the population. Afghanistan isn't listed here because they have not had a census in the past 4 census rounds. Kazakhstan has been successful, although I'm somewhat curious about the October 2021 aspirational census. We'll see what happens come October in Kazakhstan. Kyrgyzstan as well is adamant about doing a census this year. They delayed it from last year, but they haven't given us a specific date yet. Pakistan only had 2 out of the 4 censuses fielded. And while Tajikistan and Turkmenistan, or Tajikistan did hit all 4 censuses, the 2010 round and the 2020 round were highly questionable and oftentimes refused by the donor countries, working with Tajikistan as simply missing too many people and counting too many migrants. That's a direct quote from somebody at USAID. Turkmenistan hopes to have their 2020 census in 2022. Uzbekistan took a little bit of a break from counting its population in the middle 2 periods. And what I want you to remember from this chart is that if you really want to dive down and get that really detailed data at the district level, you really need these censuses as a guide. And this is a part of the world where it's really hard to rely on censuses. So we have to be a little bit more creative, and creative we shall be. So if we're looking at district level data in Kazakhstan, and we want to look at how the population changed from 1999 to 2019, what we see is that overall, although the country itself grew, enormous numbers of districts, the entire center of the country, with the exception of Astana, experienced negative growth. That really high growth rates were seen in oil-rich regions and along the southern border and in a few other locations, but that for the vast majority of districts, this was not necessarily a positive demographic time, that actually they were experiencing population decrease. And so I put this map up here just as a reminder that really looking at lower level, lower scale demographic characteristics is really important. Nationally, the picture in Kazakhstan of a positive growth rate really belays the fact that there is incredible diversity in terms of the specific areas that individuals inhabit. So to our 4 tendencies, right? The first tendency was this idea that demographic change or improvements in demographic issues like healthcare will simply reflect pre-existing regional inequality. And I have to admit, I swapped this out at the last minute because this is such a great article and I really want to encourage everyone to read it. Yamshikova and colleagues very recently posted published a wonderful article that looks at 2 waves of healthcare reform in Kyrgyzstan, the Malas Talimi, which was earlier in the period, and the Den Suluk health reforms. What they looked at was how these health reforms, which really were focusing on minimizing out-of-pocket costs and also helping people survive health catastrophes, right, that oftentimes insurance wouldn't cover, how did they work? And did they work equally across all regions? And so this is a table from this excellent article. And what they did is they said, okay, we're going to have a survey. We're going to ask people if they experienced a health catastrophe. That's the CATA. And we're going to look at people who experienced a health catastrophe because it cost 10% of their monthly wages. People who had a health catastrophe that cost 25% of the household's monthly wages, and people who had a health catastrophe that cost 40% of the household's monthly wages. So one can think, like, my goodness, that would be catastrophic, right? That's a large out-of-pocket cost. But what's interesting about this is that with just small variations from 20, at 10, 25, and 40, the standing of the regions remains pretty constant. There's some movement. Ocean Issaquah tend to move around a bit. Talas and Jalalabad tend to change. Naran stays at the bottom. Chui stays at the bottom. In general, what we're finding is that the regional susceptibility to healthcare catastrophes, whether they are small or whether they are large, seems to follow the same pattern. So it's not as if some regions only have small issues to deal with and other regions only have big health catastrophes to deal with. It looks like from these data, and particularly looking at the yearly reported health catastrophes, we're looking at a pretty stable situation. Certainly, we do see that catastrophes went up substantially in the aftermath of the Manas Talimi health reform. They also started to go down later in this period after the Den Suluk, but they seem to have pretty much had similar trajectories across all regions. To a large extent, this basically helps support the idea that these two healthcare reforms taken at the national level had some variation in regional effect, but generally really just reflected the pre-existing regional inequality. And this is also seen in terms of the Human Development Index in the regions of Turkmenistan. We can't drill down to the district level here, but we can find estimates of human development indexes for the 5 larger regions within Turkmenistan. And what we find by looking at how HDI estimates from the Global Data Lab, and the Human Development Index is simply a composite measure that looks at normalized means for education, life expectancy, and income. So it's the idea that in what areas are people really provided with the health, the wealth, and the education to make the most out of their lives. What we see in the chart is that indeed every single region seems to be increasing in terms of their estimated HDI between 2010 and 2018. And this improvement is uniform. There is a little bit of changing in the rankings as we see. Ahal falls down towards the end. Mari does not do particularly well. But in general, this is, again, a rising tide that appears to lift all boats, and the differentials are substantial between, say, Ashgabat, the capital city, and some of the less fortunate regions, but that in particular, there does seem to be a general trend that, yeah, there's still inequality and there's still differences in terms of the Human Development Index across these regions, but that over time, all regions have benefited. This is different than the picture we see in Tajikistan. Using the same data, again, the health, this Human Development Index, with health, wealth, and education. What we see in Tajikistan, surprisingly enough, is a narrowing of the differentials between the major administrative units within the country, which is quite interesting. Dushanbe, you will still be better off if you live in the capital city, and that surprises no one. But what we see between 1990 and 2018 is that the width of difference between Dushanbe and other regions is starting to shrink a bit. So here we really see narrowing inequality when we look at subnational Human Development Index estimates. So it can actually decrease inequality Unfortunately for Pakistan, it can also display growing inequality. One more time, tracking of the estimated Human Development Index for the specific regions within Pakistan. Again, not district level, we couldn't get that data, but we could recreate using numbers from the Global Data Lab, a time series data that helped us trace individual regions within the country. Long story short, what we see is that they're very bunched up as of 1990. And by 2018, the width of the spread has increased tremendously. And so in essence, what we're finding here in Pakistan is that in composite measures that really focus on health, education, and income, the differentials between regions are growing as the national average for health, for Human Development Index increases. And then fourth and finally, I'm going to wrap up quite quickly. I'm sorry, I ran a little late. I want to talk about extreme cases where you see flipping hierarchies, where demographic changes contribute to a change in what groups within your country are advantaged versus disadvantaged. And in this case, I'm drawing on research I've done previously and another project that I just started with some colleagues in Kazakhstan that looks at the demographic and health surveys, as well as the multi-indicator cluster surveys from UNICEF. These are surveys of men and women about reproductive health, about health in general, and particularly about child health and household well-being. And they've been done across time in Kazakhstan. So I list them all here. What I did is download the data to see what the relative risk for a negative child health outcome, in this case, severe stunting and wasting. This means, is a child under 5 less than 2 or more than 2 standard deviations below what one would expect in terms of height and weight, right? So these are children, these are basically failure to thrive children. And I look at that in each of these 5 national surveys. The point estimate is just what's the overall prevalence of severe stunting and wasting in Kazakhstan. And like all of our other indicators we've dealt with, this shows spectacular improvement. Nearly 1 in 4 children in 1995 who were surveyed were markedly below average for height and weight. That has fallen by 2015 to only 8% of children under 5. This is a monumental achievement, and I think in many ways we don't recognize this achievement enough. I give you the lower and upper limits for a 95% confidence interval, as well as the sample size here as well. But this final column is where we get to the flipping hierarchy. If one runs a simple logistic regression analysis, looking at the ethno-linguistic Russian effects. In essence, what I've done is taken for Kazakhstan, Kazakhs versus Kazakhs and other Central Asians versus ethno-linguistic Russians in each one of these 5 surveys, and ran a basic model with a control for residents, urban, rural, income quintile, whether they were in the bottom income quintile or not, if they had higher education, and that would be either the child's mother or father had higher education, and ran that with the variable ethnic linguistic Russian. In 1995, the data indicate with significant at the 0.01 level that Russians, the odds were 38% less, 38% lower to have a child who was severely stunted and wasted in comparison to ethno-linguistic Kazakhs. In 1999, this had fallen to only 9%, and it was significant at the 0.05 level. By 2006, ethno-linguistic identity was not significant in these models. And by 2010 and 15, what we began to see is that actually controlling for these other variables, ethno-linguistic identity in terms of being Russian tended to increase the probability that you had a child under 5 that had experienced severe stunting or wasting. In essence, Russians went from being advantaged in terms of child health markedly to being woefully disadvantaged. Much of this has to do with changing ethno-linguistic identity among the Kazakh population, selective outmigration of wealthier and therefore potentially healthier ethno-linguistic Russians, but also the idea that much of the improvements in healthcare, the benefits of having smaller families, and a myriad of other factors not only erased the deficit that ethno-linguistic Kazakhs experienced, but actually put them in a privileged position by the 2015 findings. Okay, so that's 4 examples of thinking about demographic change and asking 2 questions. Where are the improvements and for whom are they intended? I think that this gives us an interesting way to look at whether or not public policy is effective. We certainly gave you the example of the excellent work done by Kyrgyz colleagues looking at health reform. It's a different way of thinking, not just about a uniform output in terms of a national rate, but really thinking carefully about regional and even sub-regional variation. It also invites us to think about what national patterns of demographic improvement really mean when we get down to the actual lived experiences of individuals. Certainly the positive demographic growth rate in Kazakhstan gives you pause to think when one looks at the patterns in terms of districts in that country. Third, I think this invites us to think about how cultural and institutional contexts determine demographic decision-making and outcomes for individuals. Individuals make decisions based on their location, based on their socio-cultural orientation. That has an interactive and a reifying effect on the ways in which demographic benefits are distributed across a national context. And it leaves us with a really 4th and important question about how patterns of inequality inform our understanding of dissatisfaction across regions and social groups. For indeed, one can look at the positive demographic developments in Central Asia, but it's more important to inform our understanding of socio-political stability by looking at the way in which those benefits vary by social group or by geographic location. So I'm going to leave you with 3 takeaways. And the first one is just to remember there is massive demographic change in Central Asia, and this is continuingly a region of geopolitical importance. And I think really paying more attention to population as we move forward is critical. Secondly, I want to encourage scholars as well as policymakers to really focus on disaggregating national effects. The rising tide does not always lift all boats, and it's in looking at the winners and losers in development that can help inform and better predict where areas of disaffection or conflict may emerge. And third and finally, I think it's important to bring population into our understanding of inequality and to make demography much more of a central measure and central tenet in the way in which we approach social and economic inequality, because it highlights potential socio-political fissures in Central Asia, as well as other places in the globe. And so I think there's no better way to conclude a lecture that is in honor of Professor Sinor by saying that not only is Central Asia important to study, but Central Asia and better understanding its population dynamics has a lot to teach the rest of the world. And I'll end there. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Cindy, for a truly fascinating talk, wonderful data, and I urge the audience to stay around and ask questions of Professor Buckley, and I'm sure she will stay with us a little longer to answer the questions.
Okay, and so there are my glasses. There's a wonderful question from Pete Lesin. Pete, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. And he wisely asks, could you describe the scale of input that China has on demographic improvements seen in these countries? Also, what is these countries' perspective on Turkish background ethnic groups, Uyghurs, Kazakhs currently being persecuted in Western China? Pete, I can't thank you enough for this question. You have no idea how horrifying it was to know I was coming to Sousse to give a talk about Central Asia and I didn't have data for Xinjiang province. Since one of my goals in life is to come to Indiana at some point in the summer to learn Uyghur, I certainly appreciate this question greatly. So let me answer the first part. China, as part of the Belt and Road, has been very aggressive and assertive in global health diplomacy. With my colleagues on another project, Eric Heron and Ralph Clem, we have an article coming out in the Fletcher Security Review that looks at this precisely in terms of COVID. But China has really focused on international health diplomacy in Central Asia. And during the COVID epidemic, but also throughout the development program of One Belt, One Road, there's been a lot of assistance in terms of primary medical care, in terms of the exportation and in some cases donation of medical equipment and pharmaceutical resources. And so China has really wanted to set itself up for decades now, actually, as a leader in global health diplomacy. I would argue, and again, this is just my personal perspective on this from my own research, that China benefited greatly from the Trump regime's retreat from global health diplomacy by the US, which left a void that enabled China to deepen its contacts, specifically in Central Asia. So China is a big part of the health revolution, shall we say, or health improvements in Central Asia, and they would like to play a much more energetic role. Some of my colleagues in China have pointed to the fact that China also is looking towards its demographic future, which looks like it's going to be suffering from labor shortages, and therefore is very interested in maintaining contacts and potentially longer term opening up migration possibilities for Central Asian laborers to come south rather than north. But that is a process that is going to take a decade or two to emerge. And in the meanwhile, much of the migration process still is oriented towards the north and job opportunities in Russia. Central Asia, particularly Kazakhstan, but I think all Central Asian countries are really concerned about the treatment of individuals in Xinjiang, not only the Uyghur subpopulation, but also the reports of ethnic Kazakhs being persecuted and detained and sent to re-education camps resonate strongly with my colleagues in the region. I am, like so many others, really anxious to get out into the field to pursue this very, very important question more. Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, now I just see people have questions. So can you just ask them, or? April, is it possible to unmute? For I see.
Do you have a question?
Yeah, Mary Ann Camp has a question. Dr. Camp, how are you?
Hey, how are you?
Good.
A few years ago, Sophie Roche wrote a book on youth bulges in Tajikistan. And as you were describing this falling reproductive levels in Central Asia, I began to think about, well, where are those larger cohorts in their age cycles, and what impact is that having on the picture that you gave in general of fewer dependents to more workers? But I also might step outside of that and think, what does that do to opportunity structures, to political involvement, and other kind of impacts that there might be from that larger generation getting somewhat older?
Mhm. That's a great question. And indeed, a lot of the political demographic analysis that's taken place in Central Asia has really focused, much like the Middle East, on the political instability that's associated with youth bulges, right? So these very large cohorts entering into reproductive age, but also entering into the labor force. There's three things to keep in mind. The first one has to do with looking at it in terms of a total fertility rate. People are having one, as Brianna Pirelli likes to say, they're following a classic East European model of one and done. So one child, typically born early, maybe a second in Tajikistan, but certainly not a third or a fourth. And so the decline in the total fertility rate enables the youth bulge that Sophie wrote about so eloquently to have a minimal, what we call echo effect, right? So you have a big cohort. So when they hit reproductive ages, they're going to have a big cohort, and it's an echo. It's maybe not as big, but you can see it throughout the age structure. Because fertility has fallen substantially in Tajikistan, the echo effect was not as substantial as one might have predicted. The second reason, all of you know quite well, is the fact that outmigration, particularly of young men in the working ages, but increasingly now it seems some young women as well, particularly in Tajikistan, has meant a delaying of childbearing for some, which has also helped to minimize that bulge. Now, it's not for everyone. There's certainly excellent work being done highlighting the fact that there are, in essence, anchor babies, where young men get married and have that or have that first child before they go to Russia. It is, from the statistics, not a strategy that is open for women who might migrate, but this also has a dampening effect on the echo effect of the youth bulge that's been discussed in Tajikistan. And so while it is important to think about, I think both the declining rates, the outmigration, and then my third and final element here is there have been reports, and Vladimir Mukhamel of the Russian Academy of Science and several other of my colleagues in Moscow have been following fertility patterns of Tajik migrants in Russia and arguing that one strategy that seems to be emerging, and I'm questionable about this because I haven't seen national data, but one strategy is to have the child while you are in migration, because then the child has, you want to register the child as Russian born, and that is seen as advantageous. That, again, I'm soft pedaling because that's something I've heard, but I haven't seen really representative data. That's a great question, Professor Camp. Thank you so much.
Next, we have a question from Ariana Ray.
Hi, my name is Ariana. I'm a junior at IU. Thank you so much for speaking. First of all, I really enjoyed hearing everything you had to say. My question is more regarding ethnographies. I am conducting an ethnography of Iranian women born before the Islamic Revolution because my background is Iranian. So that's kind of what I'm more focused on. So I was wondering if you had any advice for someone doing their first big ethnography, like regarding ethics, for example, because I know, well, ethics was discussed a lot in our class, but I was wondering if you had any pointers.
Yeah, Ariana, I'm really excited for you, and I think that your goals are tremendous. That sounds like an amazing project. I do a lot of field work. I have learned more sitting around talking to women than I have from lots of these huge national surveys that I've been working on. And I think you will find the experience amazing and really exciting. A couple of things to keep in mind in terms of ethnography, particularly in any context like Central Asia or Iran for that matter. First is the idea of traceability. Make sure that you've done everything you can to make your respondents untraceable if they are speaking about structural impediments to their demographic decision-making, or they're talking about attitudes towards government or towards specific leaders. I think that's really important. The second element is to make sure to gather what they think and what they perceive, because that is their reality. And you need to follow the feminist methodological orientation in that, because otherwise, why do an ethnography? But at the same time, when one is collecting data about health or about access to medical care, some of my work in Central Asia was with UN AIDS about 2 decades ago. Gather as much information and insight as your respondents can share. Take their lived experience and attitudes as valid and important for you to understand. However, don't leave the interaction without providing them, in not a pushy way, but just a informative way, a couple of pamphlets that have some hotlines for them to call, or directions to the reproductive health clinic, or directions to the HIV/AIDS clinic, so that while you are gathering their rich, valid, and valuable insights to their lives, you respect what they think is most important to them and what they want to share with you. But I think it's really important, particularly for women, but really for all groups, that you leave information and you leave opportunities with them for them to maybe reconsider what some of their perspectives are. For myself, working in reproductive health, I learned new and amazing things about what was an effective contraceptive method when I was in Tajikistan 5 years ago. I think I also learned why my mother had 9 kids if these were the methods she was using. I could not question their beliefs because they were part of their lived experience. But when I left, I made sure I had pamphlets for everybody. I made sure I had contact information for reproductive health nurses, and made sure that I gave them access to things that might provide them alternative informational framing. And so I want to encourage you to consider that as you're framing your ethical approaches to your ethnography. Does that make any sense?
Yes, it does. Thank you so much.
Oh, good luck. I can't wait to read it. It sounds amazing.
Thank you. It's mostly food-based to see whether women who moved to America after the revolution still hold on to their cultural identity, or whether they leave it behind in Iran. So I kind of took what you said and applied it to my project. So I really thank you so much.
Yeah. Well, and I unfortunately only know that Iranian food is delicious, but if they're anything like some of the people I have met in my research over the past 3 decades, part and parcel of that are some interesting ideas about what is nutritious and what is healthy that might challenge other sources about what is nutritious and healthy. So that's going to be a really fascinating element to include in your story.
Thank you so much.
We'll take one more question from Dr. Bovingdon.
Thank you, April. Hello. And the reason I have my camera off, hello there. It was such a lovely talk. I have my camera off because can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay, because I'm cooking and no one wants to see that. It's hideous. But
We'll just be hungry, Gardner.
Exactly. So this was an incredibly informative talk. And obviously our methods are very different, but I learned several really amazing things from this talk, as I always do from your work. And first of all, let me say, your friendliness, your approachability have doubtless brought many more people into Central Asian studies than might otherwise have happened. So I really appreciate that. You set a great model for all of us. I was astonished to learn that Kazakhstan is majority urban. And I've been going to Kazakhstan for years and writing a book about a city in Kazakhstan. So that was, it just jumped out at me from the chart. So that was amazing. And I wondered, it's a small question connected to Marianne's. I also wanted to ask about the demographic dividend, whether you think the very high rate of urbanization in Kazakhstan is connected with the falling rate of fertility. You might have already explained that, but, and I think you already talked about whether that would compromise the payoffs of the dividend. The second question I wanted to ask is about data, and I'm no expert on this. You, I think, appropriately expressed skepticism about government collected data in these states. With regard to the rates of poverty, you expressed some skepticism about Uzbekistan's number. I was struck at how low Kazakhstan's number, having spent some time there. I can't believe only 2% of the population experience poverty. So one question, are you also skeptical about that very low number? Second, do you put more store by the HDI statistics, which I presume include some data gathering from outside, than you do in the government supplied statistics?
Okay, wow, those are great questions, and you're right on point. Urbanization, Jamshid was kind enough to mention that I spent 2 years living in New York City as director for Eurasian projects at the Social Science Research Council. And living in New York, yeah, you're not going to have 9 kids. Okay. First of all, you probably couldn't fit them all in your apartment, right? Urban residents historically, and this is true back to the 14th century. So this is a very long timeline. Urban residence is associated with lower fertility. And part of that has to do with expenses. Part of that has to do more currently with higher rates of female employment outside the home. Much of that has to do with housing space. And Zaviska and Gerber have written some great things about that. And so, yeah, the urbanizing focus in Kazakhstan, and trust me, there are still plenty of rural areas, right? And some of these urban areas are pretty small. They're not all Astana or Almaty or Chimkent, but this is a huge sea change with people in a country with konovodstva and nomadic history and all these other elements coming to grips with the fact that they are urbanizing very quickly. And that is also dampening higher rates of fertility. It doesn't quite explain the massive drop in below replacement fertility as much as cost of living, and particularly out-of-pocket costs for education and healthcare. But it is an important area that the Kazakh government is actively engaged in. Like many governments around the world, they are concerned with improving and increasing fertility. So we'll see whether that works or not. On the question about government versus external data, I have to say, having been working on this project and really turning into a hoarder for the last 3 years, gathering as much stuff as I can, there are, believe it or not, unbelievably talented, super ethical, unbelievably accurate demographers working in each of these national statistical agencies. The group in Pakistan includes several people I went to graduate school with, so maybe I'm a little biased. The group in Afghanistan is absolutely awe-inspiring in terms of the length that they go to try and get better data. So there is good government data. There are good official statistics. However, there are certain tripwires that encourage a skepticism and level of censorship from national governments. And this is not just in Central Asia. If you want to hop on the National Health Statistics website in the United States, we don't lead with racial differentials in health. And for a long time, we didn't publish them. We all know we didn't allow anybody to work on mortality rates due to handguns for years and years and years, right? So it's not just Central Asia, but I think that some things like poverty rates, unemployment rates, those are very near and dear to the presentation of state, and they oftentimes trigger more question than not. So yeah, I don't believe the Kazakh data, neither do my Kazakh colleagues, but Kazakhstan does, I believe, have a slightly lower rate of poverty than, say, Kyrgyzstan or Tajikistan. Is it, under 3%? I somehow doubt it. And so thanks for pointing that out. I really appreciate it.